Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'll share just a couple of procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function to post questions to our speaker. Our speaker, Trevor, will both answer some questions as he goes, and then for the longer, more complicated questions, we'll have that discussion at the end as well. So please do stay active in the Q&A. You'll also notice toward the end of the webinar that a survey will be shared, both in the chat and on the screen. We do hope you'll take the survey to let us know what what you'd like to see for future webinars, and if there's anything that we can do to make the experience more enjoyable for you as the viewer. You'll notice that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly after. That means you can revisit this webinar, share it with friends, with colleagues, with family, and you can also look up our previous webinars if you missed any of those. So after I'm done with the introduction, I will go ahead and put that in the chat for you so you have access to past and upcoming webinars. Without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. I'm an early career researcher with AVA, along with lead on the webinar series with a few of my amazing colleagues, Jason, who is with us here today, and a few others. Outside of that, I'm the co-director of the Frieda Center for Research on Gender-Based Violence and faculty at Capilano University in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coquitlam First Nation. And on behalf of AVA, which is a national organization, I want to begin by acknowledging that we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of Métis, First Nations, and Inuit peoples, and their rights, responsibilities, and joy in culture, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is something I'm very excited about. It's From Allies to Actors, Engaging Men and Boys in Gender Justice. We are joined today by Trevor Mayoh from NextGen Min. He is a disruptive diversity, inclusion, and violence prevention consultant who focuses on transformative projects around the world. Trevor works with government and corporate partners on deconstructing gender norms and creating innovative violence prevention programming. He possesses unique expertise from working with professional sports, hospitality, technology, extractive and post-secondary organizations internally and externally to help foster more inclusive, safe, and successful environments. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me for this conversation. Really excited to have the discussion and engage with everyone who's joined us today in this conversation of from allies to actors, and what that actually looks like, and how we have the conversation around engaging men in this conversation as well. So really briefly, as mentioned, Trevor, he, him, been working in space for quite some time, spent a lot of time in male dominant spaces, energy, mining, armed force, technology, sports, all the way through having the conversations around how to get people engaged, how to see themselves as stakeholders, not just as outside actors. And I mentioned on here the radio thing. That's not because I think AM radio is a flex at all. It also just means that I know I can talk fast. So if you're live on the line with us today and there's questions, you want to pump the brakes, want something revisited or what have you, feel free to drop that in the chat and let us know. And happy to do so. And if you're watching online, be ready to hit the rewind button on the player if that's the case. Really quick overview of some of the things that we'll go through today and what it looks like. And so we're going to start just with a little bit about NextGen Men, our approach with this work and our vibe on that. We'll talk a little bit about the context around this work. I mean, what's really happening with men and boys and what that looks like, and then the work that we do. So how do we actually engage and help people see themselves in this topic? And then we'll close out with the discussion, a bit of Q&A. So as Sarah's mentioned, I'll be watching the questions chat as we go. So if you have anything, don't feel like you need to wait to the very end for a discussion if you feel like you really want to fire it up right now. Not sure how many people are really familiar with NextGen Men as an organization. We're a not-for-profit based in Canada, really working on a future where men and boys feel less pain and cause less harm. And so we bring together different perspectives from, we work internationally as well, across genders, across specialties, to do one really core ambitious thing, and that's change the way that the world sees, acts, and thinks about masculinity. So we're really getting to the root of gender inequity by redefining what manhood really means to people and creating brave spaces that allow people to engage, to educate, and empower men and boys on gender and equality. So we do that with youth, we do that in the community, and we do that in workplaces and beyond. So I can talk a little bit more about our programs and some of the best practices that we have in terms of engaging men and boys in this space. But I'll get to that in a little bit of time when we talk about the what now and the best practices to engage. Just to kick it off in terms of framing this conversation, and engaging men in the broader work, I think we really just need the lay of the land about gender norms and experiences as well. And so just put it like a broader context, we think we sort of fly out to 30,000 feet. We think about this a little bit bigger is, I mean, women, girls have made tremendous progress under the banner of feminism for the last 7 years, with obviously a tremendous amount of work still left to be done, and the road still a lot of challenges on the way. We've really in that time shifted though, and changed, transformed a lot of women's roles and the norms in society, which has resulted in women having moved out of some of those really traditional roles that we knew many decades ago, whereas men are still remaining entrenched in a lot of those traditional stereotypes. And so we're missing that parallel conversation with and about men and our roles in society. And so if you think about it in the gas pedal, we're really stepping on the gas pedal really, really hard for women and girls, but we're also simultaneously holding the brake for boys and men. And so we know what happens when you do that. If you're driving, you end up spinning out. And that all brings together under obviously the conversation around patriarchy and how that things. And I know this is a room that definitely understands patriarchy, the system, the rigid hold it has, and some of the harms that it presents. But I think it's really important for us to think about the framing around patriarchy when we're thinking about engaging men and boys and breaking out just the academic conversation, but in real terms. Because navigating this is really about how we're going to engage them, how we talk about it, navigating that pushback and resistance around the term and the concept as well. And so when we talk about the term, let's think about it as that social system. It doesn't mean that men don't have challenges. It doesn't mean that the men that we're talking to aren't working hard. It doesn't mean that things are all amazing and shiny for men at every single moment. It's just recognizing what the system in which we're all playing and operating represents. And I think a lot of guys see this in real terms, moving out of that academic terminology, the real terms. And so it's really about like how we are performing our gender. And so this isn't about saying that, you mean, these traits are inherently masculine or feminine. It's really about how we organize them socially within the value and the judgment attached to them. And so you notice what happens if you think about your own terms, when boys show traits towards the bottom of this pyramid, they get policed, they get called weak, they get told to man up. And so it's the hierarchy here that's the problem, not the traits themselves. We need people to access all of these traits. All of us need to access across all people. But boys learn pretty early that accessing those feminine traits, comes with a social cost. So they restrict themselves more primarily to the top half. And that restriction is really what costs them the relationships, their mental health, that authentic connection as we go. And it's really important also just to acknowledge that unique identities and experiences that everyone has. So when we're referencing men, and when I'm talking about men today in this conversation, I just also want to acknowledge that no one is a monolith, and everyone has an intersectional identity that would frame these discussions. And this is really important when I'm out talking to men in the field and with leadership or on sites or in schools or wherever we're having this conversation, is really recognizing the unique lived experiences that men have, that it's not all one monolith. And for those that love Ted Lasso, I do. There's a great quote. It's like, all people are different people. And it's actually Coach Beard who says that to Ted. But, you know, I mean, it really talks about the recognizing that there is a uniqueness to everybody. And this is the coaching context in terms of recognizing people's differences and experiences to be able to coach them the most effective way in building a team. But I really think this just embodies how we need to approach this work in terms of what it looks like. So back to this patriarchy conversation, I think really important for a lot of us to think about, and I know we know the term patriarchy and we know some of the norms that are attached to it, but really think about like these two core thoughts here is, you mean, how does patriarchy really benefit men and boys? Like, what are some of the specific benefits for men and boys under the system? And then also think about like, how does patriarchy harm men and boys in real terms? And like, I think we know a lot of the benefits, those access to power, the resources, default credibility that people have, often freedom from certain kinds of scrutiny around appearance or caregiving expectations maybe. There's economic advantages that come with it, professional opportunities. There's safety around a lot of safety around different forms of gender-based violence. But there's also a lot of harms that come with patriarchy for men and boys too. That emotional restriction and isolation. There's that pressure to be the provider, the protector, with really very little room for vulnerability. There's higher suicide rates, substance abuse. There's delayed help seeking for physical and mental health. There's often a lot more shallow friendships based on activity rather than intimacy. There's loss of relationships with children when masculinity is often associated with absence in some ways or stoicism. We're really being cut off from half the human experience. And that creates a lot of challenges down the road in terms of interpersonal relationships and in different forms of violence as well. And so I think we all recognize what that looks like in real terms, that masculine script, right? Is when we talk about men's mental health and wellness today, as an example, we're primarily focusing on that gender, how societal expectations of masculinity, those rules for being a man, the pressure to conform to certain roles, and they all really impact men's mental well-being, their willingness to seek help, their ability to cultivate psychological safety for themselves and others as well. And so we're looking at some of those. And so the dominant narrative in for a lot of this, and this is the general script, it's not every single person subscribes to it, but it's one that we all recognize, I think, and our relationship to it is like that: don't show emotion, never ask for help, and like that always be tough. And so let's think about what the script looks like in real terms then, and how it actually is felt by people. So we know there's challenges in the workplace around the world. There is, very, very, very big gender challenges within, only 11% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. That moved up from 10.4 last year. So small, but still very, very small percentage. 14.9% of women are global heads of state. So radically off the general population there. And then the Canadian Labour Congress has 87 cents on the dollar. Depending on who's doing the research, that switches a little bit. So these are numbers that we all recognize. We hear them a lot. We understand some of the challenges on the macro scale here, but what does it actually mean for men to see this challenge for themselves in it? So let's go through some other numbers here. Is 3 out of 4 suicides are male. Women attempt suicide more, and men die by suicide more. Men are living 4 to 5 years less than women. That's not because you roll out with a different heart. It's because, as I mentioned before, not proactively taking care of health, working in riskier vocations, a number of different factors that go in. Men are the primary perpetrators of violence. Men are violent towards each other, to themselves and to each other as well. Disproportionately impacted by opioid overdoses and addiction, disproportionately impacted by incarceration. So when we talk about patriarchy, what does it actually mean? Like, the system sucks for everybody. It's quite literally killing men here too. And so it's challenging the script that a lot of us have played into in terms of what it looks like, and where a lot of men hit eject because they hear the conversation around, we need you in here, the challenging the privilege, we need you to step up and use some of your social capital, all these things. And like, that's not necessarily what guys are feeling. We can debate the context and the stats, but that's not what they're feeling. And that represents a big barrier in terms of how a lot of our interventions on engaging men have actually gone. Let's think about it a little bit more broadly on the mental health side here. Is 10% of Canadian men experience significant mental health challenges at least once. Roughly 1 million Canadian men are suffering from depression each year, and that requires medical intervention. Here's 2 other really key points when we think about in the workplace and how this manifests in terms of safe workplaces like psychological safety. Is 28% of men believe their jobs would be at risk if they talked about their mental health and their vulnerabilities in the workplace. And a third think that they would be overlooked for a promotion. So their job might be secure, but their career is stunted if they just showcase that vulnerability in the workplace. And so that starting to talk about some of the limits that the patriarchy is putting on men as well. And some other social numbers here that I think also builds the picture a little bit more in terms of helping men see themselves as stakeholders in this challenge. Is male loneliness has really significantly increased in studies showing that 15% of men today report having no close friends, which is a significant increase from 30 years ago. I think like 30 years ago, it was like 55% of men had 6 or more close friends, and that number has dropped to 27. So this is often called a friendship recession, and it contributes significantly to mental health outcomes and other health outcomes. So depression, suicide, a number of things. And that's significantly higher than women. I think a lot of us recognize the dangers and harms of isolation. We saw that a lot during the pandemic. We all have a much closer touch on that. But think of a few numbers here in terms of what that actually looks like for individuals. A study in 2023 found that 2/3 of young men, so that's Gen Z roughly, say that no one really knows them. 80% of Gen Z also say they would consider a virtual relationship with AI. So that isolation, there's a gap there, there's a hole, there's a challenge there, that vulnerability that is not properly being engaged and addressed, and they're seeking out different ways and different forms to address that isolation. Half of young men said that they would prefer an AI girlfriend to avoid the risk of rejection from human partners. So this isn't a woe is me or woe is men conversation. This is about recognizing the challenge of the audience we're trying to change, and recognizing really what the entry point is for that cultural change is recognizing that this culture of competition and domination is really quite harmful. And again, I work in professional sports, so I'm not coming for competition. Like that's not like competition is not the enemy. It drives innovation, achievement, growth, all those things. It becomes a problem when it is the only thing that we value and reward in boys. When we recognize that all interactions are zero-sum games with like a winner and a loser specifically in there. 1 in 3 boys feel the pressure to dominate or be in charge of others. This is really falling into the stereotypes around the belief that to dominate and control someone else is to be manly. And when they feel like they don't possess those traits of what it means to be a real man in that way, they may overcompensate with other behaviors that they perceive to fit that mold. And that can result in unhealthy relationships, violence, a number of other things. And so what happens when boys learn that being man means that someone else has to lose, that they can't collaborate, they can't be vulnerable, they can't ask for help, because all of these look like losing. So we need to really expand what winning looks like to include cooperation, emotional intelligence, care. And again, that issue isn't the desire to be strong and compete. It's really about where and how we make that choice. So back to this word that we often don't use when we're out talking with men about it, but this work, all of this work that we're doing is anti-patriarchal. If you think about it, you know, I mean, oops. If we only talk about gender equity as something that men should do for women, then we're asking them to give up something in no return. Again, we can debate the facts on which this is, but this is the feeling, and it's informed from research and like us working with men and boys every day across the country. And so that's a really tough sell. You know, behavioral science shows that people are 2 to 3 times more motivated to prevent a loss than to pursue an equivalent gain. So let's flip that frame a little bit. And what are men and boys losing under this current system? These current masculine norms that exist? Well, they're losing friendships, they're losing mental health, they're losing years off their life, they're losing the relationships with their kids, they're losing maybe the relationships with their significant other. So if we frame it as here's what you get back rather than here's what you need to give up, the engagement changes. So this isn't manipulative. This is just recognizing these benefits are very real. It's just, men are genuinely harmed by restrictive masculinities. So we're inviting them to recover what they've lost, not asking them to sacrifice for others. And that reframing is really important when we're asking people to join this work as stakeholders, not just as a passerby. And Toni Morrison has this really great quote that references like when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. And if you have some power, then your job is to empower someone else. So if we start to see ourselves in these conversations, if we start to engage men so they can see themselves saying, hey, the system is hurting me, this is challenging me, I have a role to play in challenging these systems and creating a more psychologically safe environment, a more equitable, more safe environment for other people around me? What does that look like? Then we start to recognize that we all have a little bit of power to lean on and roll in. So we know we need to do it. We know we want to be allies. We know we want to be agents in our workplaces and our relationships and our communities. And we know these stories, right? We all have our own relationship with masculinity, your own struggle of what that means. All these different inputs of from your family, your friends, your community, your media, religion, friends, job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know we need to challenge and disrupt these, but like, how's that going for us? Right? Like we recognize the challenge is still there. We know what generally know what some of the answer is, but we seem to be struggling sort of connecting those dots in that mission. So let's talk about allyship then, about like how to make this real, what it looks like. This is the definition of allyship. Cool. I mean, it's someone who's actively supports and defends the rights and dignity of individuals from social groups other than their own, especially when these individuals are not present or otherwise represent themselves. That's pretty standard. Cool. It's great. I think the one thing that I really want to lean in on when we're thinking about the conversation around allyship is like really switching it to that actively supports. A lot of people pull and say like, who here considers them an ally? And I mean, particularly men, a lot of people put their hand up and say, cool, 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 cool. But they're not actively engaged in it. That's something that they think they are, but they're not necessarily doing things challenging, disrupting, unlearning, experiencing that friction in what it looks like. So let's think about what actually ally actually looks like in real terms for people, not just a hypothetical. You know, being an ally in its different forms, it's going to cost you something. That could be time, volunteering, going to meetings, listening to stories, watching YouTube videos, whatever different form of allyship you take. But it's going to cost you something. It could be money, donating, hiring, buying. It could be social capital, challenging someone, not being invited to lunch because you had a difficult conversation. So there is a cost to being an ally, and it comes in different forms. It really is also a title that can only be bestowed on you by another person. So like, you can't just like toss on your LinkedIn, I'm an ally, because how are you actually showing up for other groups? And is it under your terms or is it for somebody else in that way? It's something that you get to do, not have to do. And think about this for a second, because a lot of time people will like in the workplace, if your boss says, hey, I really need you to attend this International Women's Day luncheon. Well, that's not an act of allyship. You were told to go. It's part of your job responsibilities. If you were reorganize your schedule because you're like, I really want to go, this is important to me, I'm prioritizing, that's different. And so it's something that you get to do, not something you have to do. The moment you're told, the moment it's something that you feel pressured or whatever that you have to do, then that's not something that you're stepping out and spending the social capital or the cost in that way. And then the other thing I would just mention too, when we think about allyship, particularly around this, is it recognizes that power and privilege exists on multiple levels. So it exists on the individual level, so an interpersonal level, you and a friend, you and your boss, that individual thing. It operates on an organizational level, which is maybe your workplace, your team, your school, whatever that organization is. And then it also happens on that systemic level, so culture writ large as well. And so navigating those three, and a lot of the time when we think about and we're challenging men around gender-based violence and asking them in terms of broader equity work, we automatically go to the systems level. And that seems really, really big for people to take on. I mean, like I can't solve the gender pay gap when I'm having a beer with my buddy at a bar. But I can, on an individual level, challenge, communicate, tell story, expand perspectives. And so really recognizing where we do have an opportunity to play and engage people is really important in that work. So the individual, organizational, and systemic. And individual is often the easiest, sometimes organizational too, depending on who you're talking to, if they're in a position of influence or power, for people to be able to lean in and see what that looks like. Circling back to that brake pedal moment we had at the beginning, this quote sticks with me a lot. And I really want to like recognize the why and the how in it. And so the quote is like, I'm glad we've begun to raise our daughters more like our sons, but it will never work until we raise our sons more like our daughters. And think of the coding around that. We rightfully tell our girls they can be anything that the boys can be. But how often do we tell our boys that they can be anything the girls can be? And think about what that means in terms of its limits, in terms of its coding, its language, in terms of how it's reinforcing some of the things that we referenced a few slides ago, and what that looks like on the broader conversation around safety, equity, psychological safety. And this isn't just like sitting in academic circles, like just a really quick, fired into Google really, really quickly. Like CNN just had an article, why girls can be boyish, but boys can't be girlish. And explored like the author talking about like, in short, they'll gain respect if they act like boys. It's about mobility. Girls who act like boys are moving up the social ladder, but boys who are acting like anything but masculine are moving down and risk losing their status. So this is coming from all over. And so again, this isn't like the doom and gloom, oh my gosh, like flip the table, but it's just recognizing where some of the challenges are in terms of, and where the most successful and needed entry point is in terms of bringing people in as stakeholders into this conversation, seeing themselves as beneficiaries of the work as well. And that really is like the what's in it for me for people. So we saw some of the stats before around mental health. So men, calling men in to say, you're a stakeholder in this, you benefit from this. Quite literally, physically, you benefit from this. Other people in your workplace, your family, your friends, people in your community, we all benefit from it. But one of the things we have to be really careful of in this conversation too is this concept of benevolent sexism as well. And like this is really emphasized by like men's role to protect and provide for women by putting them on a pedestal in like a chivalrous way. Um, and often that protection love is granted in exchange for women's compliance to traditional gender roles. Um, and it's really rooted in that like paternal and traditional beliefs that perceive women as beautiful, pure, yet delicate, precious, and therefore needed protection by men. This women are wonderful but fragile mindset. Um, this, oh, I'm going to come solve it for you in the workplace. So like I'm here, like I'll like now we can get it solved. You can't do it yourself. Well, I'm here to support. It maintains that hierarchy. And for boys learning this, it really teaches the women, that women are objects to protect, not equals to collaborate with, even if that's really subcoded. So let's think about how that actually works in real term if we look at this data. So this is a 22 university study from Tel Aviv that looked at men and how they view their supports, allyship supports. And so it was like 800 participants, and it really, the bottom line is it found that men gave less money or were less likely to donate to women in business-related hardship compared to domestic hardship. So you have 62% of men in this study would help women whose house burned down, but only 45% would donate to women whose business burned down. The difference, one's that like damsel in distress one, and the other one challenges that. So men are comfortable helping when they feel like they can be the chivalrous space in that. Less comfortable when women are in position of economic agency that's failed. So the house fire lets someone be more of a hero in that space. The business failure doesn't necessarily fit that script. And again, this is not a call out, like I'm a man. I'm not sitting here like shaming and attacking men. It is just talking about how like these really, really, really subtle things form implicit biases that we have around this. And how deeply some of this like benevolent sexism can run. Even helping that allyship thing is seen as sometimes reinforcing gender norms or falls into those categories. So let's think then about like what's preventing us. And a lot of these will seem really like straightforward for people in terms of what's preventing us from really acting when we're talking with men. This is what I'm hearing every day when I'm challenging, we're having conversations with men about like, what's holding us back from being allies, and what's holding us back from being champions? What's holding us back from really like challenging, disrupting the system? And a lot of it is the fear of retaliation of being targeted themselves. So there's this real strong fear of if they insert themselves in, things will be directed back towards them. Uh, the cost will be really high. They put themselves at risk. There is this really strong fear of losing social status, and I think we all like think about this as like high school terms, being like, oh, like popularity, social status. No, like that social currency is one of the most important things that we have, and I think it's really does a disservice if we discount it as adults about how important that is for us. And so that social status, not being invited to the lunch, not going out for drinks, not being on a group chat, having a someone not like you, that matters. Often there's power imbalances, challenging, calling out. Could be a coach and your player. It could be someone who has more social power than you. They have seniority. They are more popular. There's a number of different things there. Often people come to the conversation with like saying like there's a lack of knowledge of the individual involved. I don't know the backstory. I don't know if that's just the way that they talk. I don't know if I missed something before I walked into the room. I don't know. Maybe that's just how things in this workplace and this team or this community or this group, that's just how it works. I just don't know the backstory. This is a really key important one for all of us, no matter where you are, is again, and this is where the perception might break from the reality of it, is that they really don't think that leadership will address it. If they do, they'll make it worse. So if we're in positions of influence, whether that be in work, community, home, whatever, think about that you may have the best response about like, I'm going to do this and that, supporting and this, all the responses. But the feeling is there's a fear that it won't be addressed, or if it is addressed, the situation will become far worse. And so it's easier just to hit eject and not challenge and disrupt. And that a lot of guys just don't know what to do. They don't necessarily have the language. They don't necessarily practiced being able to navigate it might feel awkward. And so they just don't know how to broach and roll into that. Just a few more just to think about here too, is like this lack of understanding. I mean, some individuals may not really get the deeper history or understand the full aspects of someone who doesn't look and sound like them's experience and stories. They can lack the awareness of specific barriers that other people might face outside their own story. They maybe fear change, gender equity, and a lot of these initiatives often challenge traditional power and social norms. And so this can create some anxiety and resistance from those who benefit from that status quo. And they may fear perceiving losing advantages or feeling that their own contributions are going to be devalued, or a lack of fairness in those conversations. Again, can debate the context, but those are some of the feelings. It could be misconceptions about stereotypes. Some people think certain are really tied to specific gender roles and traditions, and stereotypes can create those biases that prevent individuals from recognizing and addressing different disparities. Things might not be relevant to them personally, may not be touching what they operate on. It may not be in their sphere. It may feel too far and distant from them. And then here's the number one big one. When we boil it all down, when I go and talk to men about allyship, about seeing themselves in these conversations, about challenging the norms, about creating more psychological safety, one of the biggest things that is universal across all groups is the fear of backlash, the fear of getting it wrong, and the cost associated with those, the risk associated with those. Again, we can debate the reality, but the feeling around that fear of backlash, getting it wrong, tripping up is very pronounced. And so we need to recognize those fears and those stumbles if we're going to effectively engage. How do we provide supports? How do we talk through that? How do we recognize what some of those speed bumps are so that we can chart a better path? And when I'm in chatting with men, this is one of the exercises we do. We have this conversation about like, think about a time when you witnessed something problematic happening around you and you didn't do anything. And then think about a time when you may have experienced or witnessed something and you did do something. And the conversation is less on, you mean, let's deconstruct the situation. It's more about what was present and what was not present in each of those situations. So when you didn't do something, what was present? Was it maybe the person in the room that you were with? Was it maybe the setting you were in? Like what was present and what wasn't present? Maybe you were by yourself. Maybe you didn't have friends. Maybe you didn't feel physically safe, whatever. What was present, not present? And then the time you did act, what was present there? Maybe you were the senior person, or you were surrounded by friends, or you felt like you were ready to have this conversation because you just practiced. I don't know. But like think about what was present, wasn't. And this is really important for us to navigate because these are the conditions that allowed you to lean in, to call people in, to be an ally in that space. And so this is really where the work exists, helping people recognizing what these factors are: social, practice, permission, awareness, whatever. It isn't universal. And I think that's a lot of the time when we go back to that intersectional conversation, we just think this is what men need instead of recognizing in individual situations. I mean, what did we have and what do we not have to better be able to challenge, support, target, and grow, and need to lean in what that actually looks like for people. So then how are we doing in this space? And what does it look like a little bit from some of the best practices in areas that we are? So programs are what happen, but that's not really where like the culture change happens with people. Programs and culture sustains. So you can't program your way out of a culture problem. If the environment stays toxic, then the program effects will disappear. Um, so like we obviously run workshops, have these conversations regularly, but the goal is not to run a workshop and leave. It's really about like shifting the underlying conditions that create some of the challenges. That means engaging leadership. It means changing policies. It means modeling different behaviors, making the invisible visible. The measure isn't how many people you engage with. It's more about like what behaviors are now normal that weren't normal before in that space. We talk all the time about, particularly in workplaces. I mean, policy is not culture. A lot of organizations will like write a policy statement. They'll like put it up on their interweb and like they'll be like, that we did it. Like there's their policy. People are culture. Our relationships, our communication, the elements of trust and care that are built or lost in that space, the unspoken or unwritten rules. That's culture. It can change. It takes a tremendous time to build, but it's like felt by people. And that's really where the work happens in that cultural change is, and I'll give a quick example. I was on a work site and the physical safety parameters on that site have been around forever. And but in the 80s they did a big switch to like really prioritizing physical health, and the cultures really started to catch up with the printed policies. And like I'm in a setting where like these guys in the real life would never wear a seatbelt. Government can't tell them to. But when they're on site, you know, I mean, they're putting the seatbelt on, they're three honking, they're backing in their trucks, they're filling out all the paperwork, they're doing everything because they really believe it. And then like that's that's not necessarily policy, that's cultural. That's when they joined the organization, people talked about how important this was. There was accountability, there was like, people really see it and feel it. We don't necessarily have that around psychological safety in the same way. And so we're trying to build the culture. I mean, we have the policies have been on the books, we have the legislation, but we don't have the culture around it. And so it's really about like, how do we inform these unspoken and unwritten rules, the trust, the communication, the relationships that we have with people to bring us up on the physical, the psychological safety to match the physical safety side. And that takes time. And so there's a number of lessons that we've learned from doing this work. I mean, we've been doing it for quite some time, and just a few ones for us to think about. So start with our language and concerns, not ours. So engage, you know, I mean, like when we're talking to youth as an example, and we're talking around consent, we're talking around mental health, we're talking around isolation, we're doing all that. Engage with their language, their challenges, not what we bring to the table. Meet people where they're at, understand where they are. I don't have frontline conversations with teens. We have youth team that specifically has that because they understand, they speak the language, they meet people where they're at. It's not preaching. So start with their language and their concerns, their challenges, not what we bring. Mental health and the practical benefits associated with it are far better entry points than just the conversation around gender justice for many. And so we're talking about real strategy in terms of engaging people. Like as I went back, like we talk to men and we see those stats, we see those numbers, and they understand. Be like, yeah, that's how I feel. I'm struggling. I have all these different blah 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 blah. And so chatting about like, okay, like how do we create an environment where like you feel more supported that also is safer for everybody? of all identities in your community. And that is an entry point where people lean in because they see themselves in it. And it doesn't feel zero sum. It feels collectively beneficial. Shame doesn't work. Invitations and curiosity does. Another quick example, I was in an organization and there was a guy who was told that he needed to put pronouns in his signature. And the conversation in the space was like, the guy was like, I think it's stupid. I'm not doing it, blah, 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 blah. And, like in a lot of other rooms, the pushback would have been like, that sounds like it's very like transphobic, it's challenging, blah, blah, blah. Like maybe you should think all that. Instead, it was say more. Like what's the real challenge here? And then create a space where like other people would bump around. And then there was another guy in the room and another guy like all sharing like their different thoughts on it. Some were a little bit challenging, some were not. And at the end of the conversation, this guy left with his signature, with the pronouns in his signature. And so that invitation, that curiosity is really far more effective than shame-based. People need to see themselves as stakeholders with something to gain, not problems to be resolved. A lot of the conversation in response is like viewing boys as something bad versus seeing something bad happening to boys. The conversation around adolescence, the Netflix show in the UK that inspired a lot of government action and public discourse right after was like, oh no, how do we solve the problem that is young boys and their violence, instead of saying what is driving young boys' pain and vulnerability that is creating an environment where that violent behavior, attitudes, relationships grow. People need to model the vulnerability and the emotional openness we want to see, not just prescribe it. It's really easy to say, hey, you really need to go into a room and showcase your vulnerability. You really need to showcase that. Well, like, no, we need to be ready to lead with our own. What's authentic, what's real, what's safe, create the space for other people, create the permission for other people to showcase their vulnerability after, build that trust. So that we need to model it and not just say that that's the vibe. We need to create spaces where different expressions of masculinity are already visible. So there's not just one right way. We all have different relationships with the masculine and feminine. And so we need to create spaces where people can see that diversity as well. Sustainable change really happens through relationships, not necessarily specific interventions. And so creating community is probably one of the most valuable things that you can do, that we can do. Allow people to showcase that vulnerability, have that trust, build relationships, have the ability to have people call in and out, hear other people's stories and perspectives, feel like you're being seen yourself. That's where the really sustainable change happens. And meet people where they are. Expand what's possible from there. Go into the locker room, go into the school, go into esports, into the game, go into the workplace, into the lunchroom, meet people where they are. And then explore what happens from there. And we do a number of the space. So that we have a Next Gen Men creates some of these brave, intentional spaces. We have a Next Gen Men Alliance, which is a safe online space, a Discord server for masculine identified youth to come together, learn, to challenge, to grow, and to find safe community online. In our workplaces, people are really aligned with their corporate values. So I'm not telling them to reinvent their personal ethos, but instead we tie the work and the conversations to those common values in the workplace, and people are able to have conversations using that as a foundation point. Recognizing mentors in all forms, so parents, teachers, coaches, adults, friends, providing the tools for people to role model, hold the conversations, have the trust. That's really where the work happens. It's not just a prescriptive, hey, do this, say that. And I'll give another example. Like I went into a workplace and had a conversation around gender-based violence and particularly sexual assault. Talking to the guys and be like, who feels ready to intervene and challenge? And like everyone's like, yeah, of course, if I see that, I would do that. I would, if I was at a bar, I would absolutely do that. And if I blah, 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 blah. And I'd be like, okay, what if you're at a party and your roommate or your friend or was leaving hammered with somebody or taking someone hammered upstairs? Well, then I would, and it's like this contextualization that we do, and we get a little bit more gray. And so one of the opportunities for us is saying, okay, in those type of scenarios where people, think about the most severe, but then when you start to give them more real scenarios that they might see every day, they sort of stall out. We need to provide more opportunities for people to navigate what that looks like in real terms. So the academic X, Y doesn't always work. We need to play more in that gray and understand what it looks like in real terms and have people challenge and push and look at that. And the last thing that's really important for all of us is we are all going to screw up on this journey of allyship, of growing, of the friction around what that looks like. And really, it's about providing the grace for growth. So to figure it out, to test it out, to push back, to challenge, to put our foots in our mouth. A lot of men, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about those roadblocks, those speed bumps, a lot of men hit eject when they view the cost of getting something wrong as too high. So the risk of getting it wrong, saying the wrong thing, responding the wrong way, that just feels really, really, really severe for them. And again, we can debate the context, but if their fear of like, I don't want to offend someone, I don't want to make it worse, I don't want to get canceled, I don't want to do all of these different things, if that is their calculation for them of like, that's the risk, I'm just hitting eject in this conversation. So instead, if we're grabbing them by the hand and providing them a grace of saying, like, we're going to stumble a bit, that's where the real change happens. And we've seen it borne out over and over again in youth communities and sporting communities and workplaces in terms of helping people understand how they're a stakeholder, how they're a beneficiary, how they're part of the challenging these norms and benefit. So I really do appreciate the time joining today. The QR code is to our LinkedIn if you'd like to stay in touch and hear more about the work that we're doing and how we're engaging people. Also, you can send me an email or follow us on our socials as well to see how our work of engaging men and boys around masculinity, around equity work, what that looks like. And I really look forward to some of the Q&A, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That was such a phenomenal conversation and so informative and helpful for all those here, I'm sure. Um, just a quick reminder to the folks, there will be a survey link posted in the chat from Ava Training. Please do go ahead and take that survey. And then we'll shift to the Q&A. I have a couple questions if that's okay while we wait to see if the audience has any as well. So I wish I could remember the year. I don't. It was a number of years ago. I think pre-pandemic or maybe just as we started to go back in person. A colleague of mine and I attended a meeting kind of for the launch of Next Gen Min and all those conversations. It's so cool for me to see everything that's happened since the last time I've sort of come in contact with your organization's work. And I was just wondering if you'd speak a bit to sort of that growth and that expansion and all the important work you've done, because I know it started really as this grassroots sort of initiative with a pot of money from the government to support what you were doing, but how has
Yeah.
that grown and changed?
Yeah, like we just celebrated our 11th birthday in November, and so it has been quite a growth. And from starting from just two founders coming together and struggling with their own masculinity and mental health, and talking about what that looks like, what that needs, and trying just to host those conversations. And then fast forward 11 years later, and we have a team doing this internationally. We have the first of its kind online Discord server for masculine identified youth. We're doing trips to take youth who are terminally online into the real world to build connection and figure out what that is. We're in workplaces, we're with the army, we're with energy, we're all these different spaces. So the growth has been really, really significant. But what's neat about the conversation around this is that the vibe around engaging men and boys has radically changed. And before it was like, why men and boys? Or not seen as a priority conversation in the same way. And now it's really not seen as like, okay, like they're a problem to be solved, but it's saying like they're active stakeholders, not only just in terms of challenging and systems of power or where they are or the roles that they have and the influence they have, but then also in terms of like beneficiaries of the conversation too. And that has radically changed. We have government now talking about that. We have businesses now saying, okay, what is our role in terms of creating more psychologically safe spaces? This is a key strategy to create a safe space for all identities in the workplace. In our equity work. And so it's just really been really interesting to see the conversation change. So we do have work with coaches and teachers. We're in schools providing the tools for people to do that across the country. We're in workplaces of all different types, primarily male dominant spaces, having that conversation. And so there's a lot of different programming elements we do. We've now created resources so individuals can have conversations with their kids, or if you want to have a conversation, and that I've all a bunch of different discussion topic decks. So we're really just it's been really quite significant and explosive growth, but it's really about the conversations changed because I think a lot of people recognize that we have um, bringing it back to that break in gas. We've been doing a really good job in one area, but we've also not even just not at rest, we've been holding the brake. And I think it's really been quite exciting and invigorating to see that conversation shift in the last little bit.
Absolutely. And for folks who want to start to integrate men and boys into their work, be it folks in the anti-violence sector, in research, in corporate, at universities, obviously reaching out to your organization is an excellent first step. But are there smaller steps that they can take to start doing this work on their own?
Yeah, I was just at a workplace 2 weeks ago on site, and we did focus groups. And one of the things that we were chatting about was a lot of men were being like, "No one's asked me, no one's talked to me." And whether you're in a workplace, your academic setting, wherever you are, I think one of the first entry points is just starting to be open to hearing in a really safe way where people are at. What are some of the limitations and like for instance, like a lot of workplaces have women's ERG, gender ERG. Men don't go. They don't know about it. They don't see themselves in it. Dominant narratives don't see themselves in a lot of these conversations. Like white people don't see themselves in racial conversations. Men don't see themselves in gender conversations. And so one of the big things for them was just being like, no one's talked to us about it. They've talked at them, but not with them about it. So I think the first step would be in whatever community you're in, if you're in a school, if you're in a workplace, if you're in an academic setting, is just starting with that curiosity around saying, where are people at? Where are some of the blind spots? How do I hear different stories? And that's going to inform so much of where your next step is, because then it's like, okay, I'm hearing some stories. We need to hear more stories. Or I'm hearing some stories. We need to create a space where this type of exchange can happen. That will inform your next step in that way. But again, it's just the curiosity of where you're at, what's happening.
That's so well said. Thank you. And the other question I have, it's similar but different. What are the common challenges folks might run into when they start doing this work? I know that something like creating safe spaces and really inviting and welcoming folks into those spaces, men and boys into those spaces, is probably a good first step in those safe environments. But what are some barriers or some challenges that might be common?
Yeah. So what I was mentioning earlier about like sort of like the privilege and like men not necessarily feeling privileged. Let's sort of jump that a little bit more over on like, and we all see it every single day. The pushback on like DEI initiatives is a perfect example of this. And when you talk to people about it, and you really sort of like pull like, okay, what's pushing that? And again, we can debate the reality, but like the feeling that people are experiencing there is a lack of fairness. Again, we can debate the reality, lack of fairness. That is a ground shifting. They don't see themselves. They're not sure. There's a fear. There's an insecurity. There's that vulnerability there. Those are the core essence. That's the genesis of where that pushback comes from. And so instead of navigating that space of where that pushback is, debating those points, if we can go a little bit up the chain, a little bit up on the chain, and start actively engaging, thinking about, conversing about, navigating, creating a space where people can actually start to like navigate some of those vulnerabilities a little bit more, that is one of the big things. Because that's the resistance is all born from insecurity. And if we can be real about it, and sometimes we can't even call it insecurity because people are really insecure about it. And like that's a challenging thing to work around. And so if we can create spaces, whether you want to call them safe spaces, brave spaces, if we're just having more conversations, if you're a leader, you're like, hey, let's do pulse check with members of our team, whatever that looks like for you. That's sort of the step to get going, is recognizing the pushback. I mean, some people it's born from a problematic space, but a lot of people it's fear and insecurity. And because when you actually talk about like, what does this really look like? How do you benefit? Like, okay, I see myself in this. I understand it a little bit more. But that starting point is often resistance. And so that it's the DI, it's the gender-based stuff in the workplace, it's violence, it's anything that sort of disrupts some of the norms that currently exist. It's just recognizing where that the source of the obstruction comes from.
Absolutely. So well said. And I think that's a good, not only good first steps for folks to take, but also a good thing to keep in mind as they start to try to integrate this into their work because it's incredibly important that they do.
Well, and you know the wild thing is, so like Trevor on this side and Trevor on this side different. So Trevor on this side, like I want to debate. Someone says that and be like, great, like let's go off. Give me your stats. I'll give you my stats. I'll tell you why you're wrong. I'm right. Um, Not helpful. May feel good, not helpful in terms of meeting people where they're at, helping them see this in it, and actually seeing some behavioral and attitudinal change. If I'm really interested in sustained change, it is telling this Trevor to pump the brakes, and this one to say, like, tell me more.
Yeah.
Let me understand a little bit more. It is very taxing, particularly for equity seeking and marginalized groups, to continue to wear that burden of having to hold that space for other people as they work through it. That's why collectively, if we all can start doing it and other men can start doing it with other men in that space, it reduces that burden. That lift becomes a little bit less. And so the debate feels really good. It's our knee-jerk reaction on a lot of stuff, but the sustained change comes from meeting people where they're at, understanding the vulnerability, providing a space for people to like build that trust and navigate that in a more meaningful way.
That is so beautifully said. A lot of the conversations I've heard have been a part of people like, well, you need to hold space for that. But I think holding space and meeting somewhere where they're at is like that's the important next step because you can hold space for it, but if you're not meeting a person where they're at, understanding their lived experiences, understanding reservations, all those different things, then you're missing the mark if you're just holding the space. That's so well said.
And I have one other thing on that too is like if we're genuinely interested in people having this evolving, changing, growing, expanding the perspective, then that's the work that's a bigger lift. Like that is more taxing, that's more challenging, that's more like time intensive, all these different things. Otherwise, all we're interested in doing is just policing people to comply with our worldview. And like that feels fine, that feels good in the moment, but that doesn't actually lead to real structural, systemic, organizational, or even individual change. It just leads to performance, and at best. And so that is the task for a lot of us is saying like it's really easy to say think this or you're a bad person or think this or you're problematic or blah 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 instead of like actually meeting people with that. And I go back to that the inclusion in the email signature. The
Mhm.
easy thing would have been like you have to do that. You should do that. If you don't do that, you're not in compliance with our policies. Blah 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 blah. It's problematic to think another way instead of being like say more. Like where's this coming from? Hear from other people why it matters to them. Why might it feel silly to you? Like bounce that around. He left with the stuff in his signature, and so he got there. He just needed that space to be a bit messy and clunky to get there. And guess what? He left not because he was told to, because he's like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And so that's the call to action for a lot of us is like, how do we meet people in that arena to be able to be a bit choppy? And it requires a lot of us to join into that effort. So it's just not equity seeking groups having to wear that burden in creating those spaces.
Definitely. And the last thing that comes to mind for me is sort of the questions we wrap up because I don't think there's anything coming into the Q&A specifically is I think your work deserves to be celebrated because it's so important. And we always talk about those big picture wins, but what for you is one of the coolest or most exciting wins or accomplishments that Next Gen Min has made?
I love that. I think it won't feel as big because everyone will be like, we started this program, this funding, this, all that type of stuff. And I think that's really important. When I see some of the texts that come in through our youth team from boys who are dealing with mental health challenges, we're contemplating self harm, we're talking about isolation and rejection and having nowhere to put it. And I see our youth team navigating that. And I see boys being able to find a space, a safe space where they can actually do that. Like it even just gives me goosebumps just in here right now thinking about it. And like that is so powerful in terms of seeing the need and seeing the response of like what it looks like when we can create those spaces and in a real authentic way. And I like we want to do more of that. And so that's the really cool thing with our work is that I mean hopefully we can continue to scale it because there's a tremendous need out there. But I think that's probably our biggest win is our impact with the youth and what it looks like in real terms.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why I ask a question like that. Because from the outside, people are like, oh, you got grants, so you started programs. But the coolest part, I think, is those little wins, the victories.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I feel like I'm gonna sneeze. Hmm. Anyway, thank you so much. Truly, this has been fantastic. Oh my. And we just appreciate your time and we appreciate your expertise and everything you've shared with us today. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it.